In this lesson, we will take a look at some more V-Ray texture types that you can use in your projects. First, make sure your main render view is called 01 Cabinet Edge Close-Up. If you start the IPR, you can see a wooden cabinet and a record player placed on it. Now in the Asset Editor, go to the Material list, and let's search for Wood B. Select it, and then expand the right-hand flyout menu to see more options. We're going to play with the Diffuse Texture slot. First of all, let's right-click and copy the wood texture, and then go ahead and swap the current bitmap texture with a dirt texture by clicking on the dirt from the list to replace the bitmap texture. The dirt texture's first two parameters are the unoccluded and the occluded colors. For the unoccluded, we want to right-click and paste the wood texture we copied. Next, we will focus more on the occluded color parameter. Occluded areas are those that are in proximity with another surface, whether elements of the same object or another adjacent object. Think of crevices or corners, for example. If we change the occluded color to red, you will see it appears where the record player is placed on the cabinet, and also in the cabinet's recesses. Let's also draw a render region in the frame buffer to preview the changes faster. The radius parameter determines the surface area that the dirt texture will affect or cover. We can also add a texture to this parameter to have more specific control over the spread of the dirt effect. You can see this more clearly if we add a 3D noise texture here and set its amplitude to something like 3. Increasing the frequency to something like 25 will expose the effect even more. For now, we don't need to use a texture to define the radius parameter, so let's go back and right-click on the texture map to clear it. Meanwhile, you'll see in the preview that increasing the distribution parameter to 10 makes the occluded color more dense near the contact areas. For now, let's reset both the distribution and the radius back to 1. Next, let's try the Self-Occlusion Only toggle. This will disregard any occlusion from other objects so that the object is occluded only by itself. The Ignore Self-Occluded parameter means the opposite. The object will not occlude itself, but other objects will occlude it based on proximity. The next parameter, Invert Normals, literally means that instead of occluding corners and crevices, now only open corners and edges will be occluded. In the IPR, I'll redraw the render region here so you can see that the corners turn red when this feature is enabled. There are also some other advanced parameters here you can play with, but for now, let's expand the Bias tab to see how we can further control the occlusion effect with the dirt material. Adjusting the bias Z, for example, shifts the dirt on the Z-axis, moving the red color up in our object. If you want the opposite effect, you can use a negative value and the dirt shifts heavily down on the Z-axis. Let's reset the value back to 0 and also toggle off the Invert Normals parameter. We also don't need the render region for now, so let's disable it. Now let's go ahead and change the occluded color from red to a dark color, like the one here on my screen. For the next step, go ahead and stop the IPR, and then let's add the Extra Text Render element. To do that, go to the Settings tab, and under Render Elements, click on the Add Render Element field, and choose Extra Text. Then expand the Extra Text Elements settings. And for the texture, let's add a map and choose Dirt from the list. Then, let's do a production render. Once the render is finished, click on the Render Elements drop-down menu in the top left of the frame buffer, and go to the Extra Text channel. As you can see, the dirt texture we added now shows us which areas in the image are occluded, acting as an ambient occlusion render element, which can be used for additional compositing. Now let's switch back to the RGB color channel and change the camera view to 02 Cabinet Close-Up. Then, close the Asset Editor and the frame buffer and select the cabinet object in your Rhino viewport. Click on the Edit V-Ray material and the Asset Editor will open with the cabinet's material selected. Let's start an interactive render. Notice that the tiling of the cabinet's wood texture isn't set properly. Let's see how we can fix that. First, let's copy the wood texture from the Diffuse Color texture slot, and then swap that bitmap texture with the V-Ray triplanar texture from the list on the left. Using the triplanar texture is a handy alternative for assigning a 2D texture to an object that does not have satisfactory UVs. Next, in the Texture X map slot, let's paste the wood texture we just copied. Now we will have better control over how the tiling will be applied to the cabinet. Let's increase the size of the texture to 100. Also, notice how the blending amount shows the edges of the texture if set to 0, but it will blur the edges if the slider is set to 1. For now, we'll keep the blending amount to 0.3, so there is a smooth blending between the different projections of the texture. Next, let's look at the mode. Flip down this menu and choose the XYZ Textures option. This setting uses a different texture for each of the 3 existing planes, X, Y, and Z, so that we can have even more control over the projection of the textures. You'll see that the interior of the cabinet's recess is now black in the IPR. This is because we have only applied the wood texture to the X-axis, and the Y and Z textures have no map assigned. To understand this better, let's slide the texture Y slider, revealing its location where the white color appears in the IPR. Now, we want to rotate the inner texture to align it with the X-axis projection. Let's paste the same wood texture we copied earlier to the texture Y map. Then, enter the texture's controls by left-clicking on it, and then click once more on the Color Input texture slot for the color correction. Now, scroll down in the bitmap parameters to find the texture placement dropdown. And let's change the orientation by setting the rotation to 90 degrees. Notice in the IPR how the texture is rotated 90 degrees, and as a result, it is now smoothly blending across the corners. Let's back out again to the triplanar texture and copy over the texture Y mapping to texture Z by dragging it onto the texture Z map slot. Now the entire wood projection is smoothly blended throughout the circular recess. Finally, let's set the mode back to one texture like so, and stop the render for the next step. Now I will switch to the render view called 03 Flower Pots Close-Up. In this scene, we have 3 pots placed on a tray. I'm going to show you how you can assign one material to them all, but use it to quickly assign different colors to each pot. To start, we'll need to adjust the object ID for each of them. Select the first pot, and go to the Properties tab to the right, and make sure the V-Ray Properties is selected. Notice the Object ID section. Go to Set ID, and let's type 1 for our first pot and hit Enter. Select the second pot, and set the ID to 2. Now select the third pot, but leave the ID number at the default 0. Next, let's open the Asset Editor and start the interactive render. Notice that the pots currently appear white. Let's select a render region around the pots for a faster preview. Now go to the material list and let's search for Flower Pot, which I have set up ahead of time and which will work fine for this scene. Navigate to the diffuse color and let's select a texture. Choose the multi-sub texture and let's review its features. Notice that in the parameters section, there's a default color which is automatically applied to our pots. The Get ID From option is also by default set to Object ID. This means that when we assign different colors to each pot, V-Ray will consider the object ID we set earlier, and will match that color to the object ID number for each pot. Next, let's click on this button 3 times to add 3 texture layers. Since the default color for each layer is black, notice all 3 pots turned black as well. Let's change this. In the first layer numbered 0, click on the color swatch and pick a light red or pink color. Now you'll see that the third pot turns pink since it has the object ID of 0 assigned to it. Feel free to experiment with other colors, but for now, I will settle on a light green. For the second layer, I will pick a blue color. And for the third layer, I'll choose a slightly desaturated red. Keep in mind that instead of colors, you can also apply V-Ray textures using the map slots here, if you wish to customize the look of your objects even further. Also, for the Get ID From parameter, the Object ID setting is the default, but you can expand the menu to explore some other options as well. Okay, let's close the Asset Editor, remove the region render, and then we can stop the interactive render. Now let's select the 04 Cactus Face close-up And let's take a look at that view. We are going to explore the rounded edges texture to create a similar fillet effect, as seen on this face here. First, let's start the interactive render, and I'll let this render a bit so you can get a sense of the scene and how the vase looks with less noise. Next, I'm going to draw a region around the vase for a faster preview result. And again, let it render a bit. Finally, I will draw an even smaller region on the right half of the vase. Notice the filleted edges of this vase where I zoom in here. Now let's go to the Layers tab, and under the Small Cactus Vase layer group, hide the geometric vase layer, and unhide the faceted geometric vase layer. Then I'll let it render some more again. As you can see in this side-by-side comparison, the faceted vase on the right doesn't have any fillets. Rather, its edges are quite sharp looking compared to the vase on the left. Let's open the asset editor and select the Cactus Vase faceted material and pop open the right flyout menu. Under Maps, you will see the Bump and Normal Mapping menu. Let's enable the Bump map and let that load a bit in the IPR. Then click on the Texture Map swatch. Scroll down to the Ray Traced Textures section and let's select the Edges option. Now you can already see in the IPR that our edges don't appear as sharp as before. Let's increase the width value up to 1 and observe the drastic change that has on the sharpness. Also, notice how thick the line has become in the texture window itself at the top. Now let's turn down the value back to 0.5 to match the filleted geometry on the left. And as you can see, the effect is almost identical now to the vase with the fillets. Notice under Round Edges that there is also a Same Object Only option. To better show what this effect does, I will draw a new region at the bottom of the vase. I'll also go to the Layers tab again and unhide the vase stand layer. Now, select the unhidden object and apply the Cactus Vase faceted material to it. You can clearly see now that the two objects intersect each other with a clear, sharp line. To make them look like one, head back into the Bump texture again and toggle off the Edge's Same Object Only option. Now, you'll see that the objects have a nice highlight caching fillet effect between them, and they appear as one whole object.